Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are venturing into the forgotten corners of Pennsylvania, where small towns harbor secrets that refuse to stay buried. 10 stories from communities so isolated that when something goes wrong, help does not come, and the truth gets buried along with the victims. These are not campfire tales passed down through generations. These are documented nightmares from people who made one wrong decision, knocked on one wrong door, or stayed in one wrong place just a little too long. From basements that defy the laws of time to creatures that should not exist. From crimes that authorities refuse to acknowledge to disappearances that entire towns pretend never happened. Tonight, you will hear what happens when ordinary people encountered the extraordinary darkness lurking in America's rural heartland. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. February always makes me think about inheritance and all the complicated baggage that comes with things you never asked for but cannot refuse. I had just turned 34 that winter, working as a freelance architectural consultant in Philadelphia, living in a decent one-bedroom apartment in Fishtown where I could walk to my favorite coffee shop and pretend I had my life together. My grandmother Eleonora passed away on a Tuesday morning in early February, peacefully in her sleep according to the hospice nurse who found her. And 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office in Schuylkill County being handed keys to a house I had visited exactly twice in my entire life. The Victorian sat on 4 acres outside a town called Minersville, population barely cracking 4,000. The kind of place where the biggest employer was a Dollar General, and everyone knew your business before you did. Grandmother Eleonora had been estranged from most of the family for reasons nobody would explain in detail. Just vague references to her becoming difficult after my grandfather died in 1987, paranoid and obsessive about that house in ways that made family gatherings uncomfortable. My mother had stopped visiting her entirely by the time I was 7, and when I asked why we never went to Grandma's house anymore, she would just say that some places hold on to darkness longer than they should. The lawyer, a tired-looking man named Mr. Kowalski with coffee stains on his shirt collar, handed me a thick manila envelope along with the keys and said something that stuck with me, even though I tried to dismiss it at the time. He mentioned that Eleonora had left specific instructions that I was not to sell the property for at least 1 year, that I needed to spend time there, go through her belongings, understand what I was inheriting before making any decisions. He emphasized the word understand in this weighted way that made it sound less like legal advice and more like a warning. I signed the papers, pocketed the keys, and drove the 2 hours back to Philadelphia telling myself I would deal with it all in the spring when the weather was better and I had fewer projects on my desk. But the house had other plans. Or maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was the dreams that started the night after I inherited it. Dreams where I walked through rooms I had never seen but somehow recognized. Where I heard my grandmother's voice calling my name from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. I finally drove out to Minersville on a Saturday in late March, telling my girlfriend Jenna I would be back by Sunday evening. The house looked exactly like the photos from the estate documents. A 3-story Victorian painted deep gray with black shutters, elaborate gingerbread trim along the eaves, and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle like a frown. The property sat at the end of a dirt road called Colebrook Lane, surrounded by bare trees and the remnants of what had once been gardens, but were now just overgrown tangles of dead vegetation. My grandmother's car, a 1990s Buick the color of old bone, still sat in the gravel driveway covered in pollen and bird droppings. I let myself in through the front door, which opened with this long, creaking sound that would have been cliché if it had not been so genuinely unsettling, and stood in the entryway, breathing in decades of accumulated dust and something else. Something like copper and old paper and time itself decomposing. The first floor was frozen in approximately 1985 based on the furniture and decor. Floral wallpaper, heavy velvet curtains, a television with wooden paneling and dials instead of buttons. Family photos covered every available surface, but I noticed they all stopped at a certain point. Nothing after 1987, the year my grandfather died. I spent the first hour just walking through rooms, opening closets, trying to get a sense of how my grandmother had lived here alone for nearly 40 years. The kitchen still had dishes in the drying rack, a calendar from 2024 hanging on the wall with doctor's appointments marked in shaky handwriting. Her bedroom on the second floor looked almost hotel-like in its impersonal tidiness. Bed made with hospital corners, nothing on the nightstand except a lamp, and a Bible so worn the spine had completely separated. But it was the door at the end of the second floor hallway that kept drawing my attention. A door that looked different from all the others, heavier, with a deadbolt lock installed on the outside. The kind of lock meant to keep something in, not keep something out. I tried the keys Mr. Kowalski had given me until I found the one that fit. This old brass skeleton key that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel, and when the deadbolt finally slid back with a metallic thunk that echoed through the empty house, the door swung inward on its own, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. Not a closet like I had assumed, but a staircase, steep and narrow, descending into what I realized must be the basement. I had walked the entire perimeter of the house outside, and had not seen any basement windows, which meant it was completely sealed, no natural light, no ventilation. The air that came up from below smelled wrong, not musty like a normal basement, but almost sterile, like a hospital corridor or a laboratory. I used my phone flashlight and started down, counting the steps, 15 of them, each one creaking under my weight in a different pitch, like the house was playing some discordant melody. The basement was much larger than it should have been based on the house's footprint, stretching in multiple directions beyond where the foundation walls should have ended. The ceiling was low, probably 6 feet at most, and the floor was bare concrete covered in a fine layer of dust that showed no footprints except my own, as if nobody had been down here in years, despite the locked door suggesting otherwise. Metal. Shelving units lined the walls filled with glass jars containing liquids that had long since evaporated, leaving behind crystalline residue. But it was the desk in the center of the room that stopped me cold. A massive oak desk covered in journals, dozens of them. All identical black leather-bound books with dates written on the spines in my grandmother's handwriting. The earliest one I could see was dated 1987, the year my grandfather died. The most recent was dated 2025, this year, which should have been impossible because my grandmother had died in February, and it was still only March. I opened the most recent journal with hands that had started trembling without my permission, and the first entry was dated February 18th, 2025, the day my grandmother died. But the handwriting did not look shaky or weak like you would expect from an 86-year-old woman on her deathbed. It was firm, precise, almost mechanical in its consistency. The entry read, "Oliver will inherit the house today. He does not know yet, but the date has already been written. March 16th. It always happens on March 16th, has been happening on March 16th since the house was built in 1889. The house remembers even when we do not. I've tried to warn them all, tried to break the cycle, but time here does not move the way it should. It loops, it calculates, it consumes." I flipped backward through the pages and found entry after entry documenting impossible things. Conversations my grandmother claimed to have had with people who had been dead for decades, including my grandfather, including her own parents. She wrote about objects moving on their own, about finding items in the basement that she had thrown away years earlier, about waking up some mornings to discover entire days had been erased from her memory, but documented in the journals she did not remember writing. One entry from October 1993 described finding a newspaper in the basement dated March 16, 2008, 15 years in the future at that time, with an obituary section that included names of people who were still alive in 1993, but would die exactly as the newspaper described. She had kept the newspaper, she wrote, hidden it in a metal box under the floorboards. And when March 16, 2008 actually arrived, she bought that day's real newspaper and compared them. They were identical, word for word, including the obituaries. Another entry from 2003 documented how she had started finding journals in the basement that she had not written yet. Journals dated years ahead containing entries about events that had not happened, written in her handwriting, describing her future with terrifying accuracy. By 2010, the entries became more frantic, more desperate. She wrote about trying to leave, packing bags and driving away, but always ending up back at the house with no memory of the return trip. She wrote about calling priests, paranormal investigators, physicists, anyone who might understand what was happening, but their voices would become distorted on the phone, their words looping and repeating until the calls disconnected themselves. I do not know how long I sat at that desk reading, but when I finally looked at my phone to check the time, it was 11:47 p.m., and I had 17 missed calls from Jenna, which made no sense because I had arrived at the house around 2:15 p.m. and could not have possibly been in the basement for almost 10 hours. My phone battery was at 3% even though it had been fully charged when I arrived. I stood up too quickly and hit my head on one of the low-hanging pipes, hard enough that I saw stars, and when my vision cleared, I noticed something I had somehow missed before. The walls of the basement, all of them, were covered in dates written in chalk, hundreds of dates, maybe thousands, all March 16th but different years. March 16th, 1889, March 16th, 1923, March 16th, 1954, March 16th, 1987, March 16th, 2025, and written next to the 2025 date in chalk so fresh it smudged when I touched it was my name, Oliver Grant, basement, 11:52 p.m. I ran. I do not remember climbing the stairs or locking the door or getting to my car, but suddenly I was sitting in the driveway with the engine running and my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had gone white. The house looked different in the darkness, the windows reflecting my headlights in ways that made them look like eyes. Watching. Calculating. I drove back to Philadelphia, going 15 over the speed limit the entire way, and when I got home, Jenna was furious, saying I had promised to stay in touch, that she had been worried sick. I tried to tell her about the basement, about the journals, but the words came out wrong, jumbled, like my brain could not properly arrange them into coherent sentences. She thought I was having some kind of breakdown, grief finally catching up to me, and maybe she was right. Maybe I had imagined all of it. Maybe grief does strange things to perception and memory. But 3 days later, on March 16th, I woke up in my Philadelphia apartment at 6 a.m. to find one of my grandmother's journals sitting on my nightstand, the one dated 2025, open to a page I had not read. The entry was dated March 16th, 2025, written in her handwriting, and it said, Oliver came to the basement on March 15th, just as the house knew he would. He read the journals. He saw his name. He ran, but running does not matter. The house has already calculated his return. Some inheritances cannot be refused. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. He will understand soon what I understood in 1987 when Thomas died, and I found his journals in the basement. The ones he had not written yet, the ones describing my future. Time here is not linear. It is circular. It is hungry. It remembers everything and forgets nothing. Oliver will come back. They always come back, because the house is not just in Minersville anymore. It is wherever the bloodline goes. It follows. It waits. It calculates. I still own the house. I've not been back since that night, have not even driven through Schuylkill County if I can help it. But things have started happening in my apartment. Small things at first. Objects moving when I am not looking. My own handwriting appearing in notebooks I do not remember opening. And every night at 11:52 p.m., no matter where I am or what I am doing, I hear it. The sound of a deadbolt sliding back. The creak of a door opening, 15 steps descending into darkness. My grandmother was right. Some inheritances cannot be refused, and March 16th keeps coming, year after year, calculating my future in chalk on basement walls I cannot escape. My family has been farming the same 340 acres in Potter County since 1887, back when my great-great-grandfather bought the land for almost nothing, because everyone said the soil was too rocky and the winters too brutal for anything to survive. They were wrong, or maybe just stubborn enough to prove wrong. And 4 generations later, I was still here, still working the same fields, still fighting the same unforgiving Pennsylvania weather that could swing from 60 degrees to freezing in the span of an afternoon. I turned 38 that April, unmarried, no kids, just me and the land, and a rotating crew of seasonal workers who helped during planting and harvest. My parents had retired to Florida 3 years earlier, signed the deed over to me with this mixture of relief and guilt, like they were glad to escape but worried I would never be able to. The farm sat at the edge of Allegheny National Forest, about 12 miles outside a town called Galton, where the population had been slowly dying since the lumber mills closed in the 1960s. Our nearest neighbor was the Kowalski family, dairy farmers 2 miles west, and beyond that just thousands of acres of dense forest where cell phone signals went to die, and people still disappeared often enough that the state police had a dedicated search and rescue team stationed in Coudersport. The livestock problems started in late September, right as I was preparing to bring the sheep down from the upper pasture for winter. I ran a small operation, maybe 60 head of sheep, 24 chickens, and 4 cattle that I kept mostly out of sentimentality because my grandfather had loved his cows more than he loved most people. I woke up on a Thursday morning to find one of my ewes dead in the north pasture. Not just dead, but destroyed, torn apart in a way that made my stomach turn even after 20 years of farm life, where death was a regular occurrence. The carcass looked like it had been pulled apart by something with incredible strength. Ribs cracked open and spread wide, internal organs missing entirely. But the strange part was how clean it all was. No blood trail leading away from the body, no scattered pieces, just this perfectly placed carnage like something had fed methodically and then arranged the remains for display. I called Jim Kowalski, asked if his dogs had gotten loose, even though I knew his border collies were too well trained to attack livestock. He drove over, took one look at the carcass, and went pale in a way I had never seen before. He told me to call the Game Commission, report it as a bear attack, and whatever I did, do not go into the forest alone until they figured out what was happening. The Game Commission sent a warden named Derek Peterson, mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face you get from spending 30 years outdoors in Pennsylvania weather. He examined the dead ewe, took photos from multiple angles, measured the bite marks and claw patterns, and then stood there for a long minute just staring at the tree line about 200 yards north of where the kill had happened. When I asked him what he thought it was, he said, "Bears do not hunt like this, that the bite radius was wrong, too wide, and the claw marks showed a gait pattern that did not match any predator native to Pennsylvania." He mentioned that they had gotten 3 similar reports in the past month from farms scattered throughout Potter and McKean counties, all along the forest edge, all with the same strange characteristics. He suggested I bring my remaining livestock closer to the house, install motion sensor lights, maybe get a firearm if I did not already have one. Then he said something that made my skin prickle. He mentioned that his grandfather had been a warden back in the 1950s and used to tell stories about things in the Allegheny forest that the commission did not officially acknowledge, things that old-timers called the tall walkers. But those were just stories, right? Just folklore that people told to explain away the occasional strange kill or missing hunter. I lost 2 more sheep over the next 3 weeks, both times finding them in the same condition, systematically destroyed but eerily clean, like whatever was killing them had surgical precision. I started keeping the flock penned closer to the barn at night, installed the motion lights Derek had suggested, and dug my grandfather's old Remington 870 shotgun out of the gun safe in the basement. My sleep became fractured, broken by every sound, every creak of the old farmhouse settling, every gust of wind rattling the windows. I started sleeping in the guest bedroom on the second floor because it had a clear view of the north pasture and the tree line beyond, and that is how I saw it the first time. October 12th, around 2:30 in the morning, the motion lights kicked on, flooding the area between the barn and the fence line with harsh white light. Something was standing at the edge of the illumination, just barely visible, and for a confused moment my brain tried to process it as a person, someone standing upright on two legs, maybe 6.5 or 7 feet tall. But the proportions were wrong, the shoulders too broad, the head too large and shaped wrong, and when it turned to look directly at the house, directly at my window, I saw its eyes catch the light and reflect back this bright amber color, like an animal's eyes do, but wrong. Too intelligent, too focused. I grabbed the shotgun and my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen, and managed to start a video recording while keeping the camera pointed out the window. The creature, because that was the only word my brain could supply, moved with this strange loping gait that was neither fully human nor fully animal, sometimes dropping to all fours for a few steps, then rising back up to walk on its hind legs. It circled the motion light perimeter like it was testing the boundaries, and I could see its body was covered in dark fur or hair, thick and shaggy, with what looked like an elongated snout or muzzle. It spent maybe 5 minutes out there, and then it simply walked back toward the tree line, not running or fleeing, just calmly returning to the forest like it had finished whatever assessment it had come to make. I watched until the motion lights timed out, and darkness swallowed everything again, and then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and my finger on the shotgun's safety until the sun came up. I called Derek Peterson at 6 a.m. and told him I had video evidence of whatever was killing my livestock. He arrived within an hour, brought a colleague from the state office, a younger guy named Martinez who had a degree in wildlife biology, and the kind of skeptical expression that said he had already decided I was wasting his time before he even watched the footage. We sat at my kitchen table while I played the video on my phone, and I watched Derek's face carefully. He did not look surprised exactly, more resigned, like he was seeing confirmation of something he had hoped would not be true. Martinez kept pausing the video, zooming in on the creature, asking if I had considered that it might be a person in a costume, someone from town playing a prank, because there was no known animal that matched what the video showed. Derek cut him off, told him to file an official report documenting an unknown predator, and to recommend that area farms take enhanced security measures. And then, after Martinez left, Derek sat back down at my table and asked if I had ever heard the old stories about the walkers. He told me that his grandfather had documented dozens of sightings between 1945 and 1978, all concentrated in a roughly 30 square mile area of the Allegheny forest bordering Potter County. Hunters who swore they had seen something walking upright through the trees. Farmers who found livestock killed in ways that made no biological sense. Campers who reported feeling watched by something they never saw but knew was there, something that tracked them for miles before finally leaving them alone. The official stance from the Game Commission had always been misidentified bears, maybe the occasional escaped exotic animal, definitely not the bipedal wolf creatures that the old-timers described. But Derek's grandfather had kept unofficial records, photographs that were too blurry to prove anything, plaster casts of footprints that were 18 inches long and showed 5 toes, but wrong proportions, more human than canine, but clearly neither. Those records had disappeared when his grandfather retired, either lost or deliberately destroyed, and the official position remained that no such creature existed in Pennsylvania. The attacks continued through October and into November, escalating in frequency and boldness. I found tracks in the mud around the barn, massive prints that showed the creature walking on 2 legs, coming within 20 feet of my house. I installed trail cameras at 6 different locations around the property perimeter, and the footage I captured over the next 2 weeks was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The creature appeared almost nightly, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always approaching from the forest, always moving with that strange bipedal gait. In one clip, it stood perfectly still for nearly 3 minutes, staring directly at the camera, and I could see its face clearly enough to know that no costume or misidentified animal could explain what I was seeing. The muzzle was elongated like a wolf's, but the eyes were positioned too forward, too human, showing depth perception and intelligence that made my stomach knot with primal fear. In another clip, it dropped to all fours and ran with such speed that it crossed a 100-yard section of pasture in maybe 8 seconds, moving faster than any deer or bear possibly could. I stopped sleeping in the house entirely by mid-November, started staying with Jim and Sandra Kowalski, driving back to my farm each morning to tend to the reduced livestock I still had. Jim never said "I told you so," just set up their guest room and made sure I had a key to their place. Sandra, who had lived in Potter County her entire 72 years, sat me down one evening and told me stories her grandmother had told her. Stories about the old days, when the lumber companies were clear-cutting the forest and would occasionally lose entire logging camps to what they called forest fever. Men who would wander off into the trees and never come back, or come back changed, speaking in languages nobody recognized, their eyes reflecting light like animals. The lumber companies had hushed it up, blamed it on industrial accidents and worker desertions, but the families knew. The forest had things in it that predated human settlement, things that the Native Americans had known about and respected and given wide berth, and white settlers had ignored those warnings because they always did. December brought the first real snow, and the attacks stopped completely. My trail cameras showed nothing but deer and the occasional fox. Derek Peterson called to check in, said the same pattern had held throughout the region, that whatever these things were, they seemed to become dormant or migrate during the deepest winter months. He suggested I use the quiet period to reinforce my property security. Maybe consider getting a livestock guardian dog, something large and aggressive enough to potentially deter the creatures. I spent the winter months repairing fences, installing better lighting, and researching everything I could find about cryptid sightings in Pennsylvania. The internet was full of Bigfoot nonsense and obvious hoaxes, but buried in forums and old newspaper archives, I found threads of consistency, patterns of sightings concentrated in the same areas over decades, always described with similar characteristics, always dismissed by officials. The creatures came back in late March as the snow melted and the temperatures climbed back above freezing. I was ready this time, had motion sensors connected to an alarm system, had reinforced the barn and the chicken coop, had 2 livestock guardian dogs, massive Great Pyrenees brothers I had bought from a breeder in New York, specifically trained to protect against predators. The first night the motion alarms went off, both dogs went absolutely berserk, barking with such intensity I could hear them from the Kowalski's house 2 miles away. I drove back expecting to find another dead sheep, but instead found both dogs backed against the barn door, hackles raised, still barking at the tree line, where I could see multiple sets of amber eyes reflecting in the darkness. Not one creature. At least 4, maybe more, standing just beyond the fence line, watching, calculating. They stayed for almost 20 minutes, and then, like they had reached some collective decision, they turned and disappeared back into the forest. I still farm the land, still wake up before dawn to tend to livestock and fields that have been in my family for 4 generations. But I do not go near the forest edge anymore, do not let the sheep graze the north pasture, have essentially conceded 100 acres back to whatever lives in those trees. Jim Kowalski told me his grandfather did the same thing back in the 1940s, just accepted that certain parts of the property were off limits, and the farm had survived just fine. The creatures still appear sometimes, usually during the transitional seasons when spring becomes summer or fall becomes winter. My trail cameras capture them walking the perimeter, maintaining whatever boundary they have established. Derek Peterson visits every few months, downloads the footage from my cameras for his unofficial records that will never be officially acknowledged. And I have learned what my ancestors learned generations ago. Some things in Pennsylvania existed before we arrived and will exist long after we are gone. The smart ones do not fight it. They just learn to coexist and hope that is enough. Dillsburg is the sort of place people pass through without stopping. A few quiet streets, a faded colonial downtown, and the rolling hills of York County stretching out in every direction. I grew up 10 miles south and spent my college years telling myself I would never move back. Yet here I was, newly 30, and teaching remote data analysis for a major software company, signing a lease on a renovated colonial home just outside Old Route 15 because it was cheap, quiet, and the kind of place where I could finally get some work done without the distractions of city life. The real estate listing promised charm, period features, and unique architectural quirks. Quirks, I soon discovered, had very little to do with the wallpaper or the crown molding. The first few weeks passed quietly. I unpacked my textbooks and gadgets, set up my dual monitors in a spare room overlooking the garden, and settled into the rhythms of remote work. Evenings slipped by in gentle routines, video calls with my college friends, runs around the block, grocery trips to the local Weiss. There was a sense of peace, but also a strangeness to the house that I could not explain. At night, I often found myself inexplicably restless, as if I was waiting for something. Doors closed themselves with a soft click. Footsteps echoed on the old hardwood floors, the kind that made you question whether the house was settling or listening. It started with numbers. I noticed it the third time I tried to measure the living room for a new sofa. I stretched the measuring tape across the floor, 12 feet, 6 inches, then did it again, just to be sure. The second time, it was 12 feet, 9 inches. I told myself I must have misread or made a mistake. But the next day it happened again. The dimensions shifted, just slightly. It was not my imagination, so I started documenting everything, photographing each measurement, logging dates and times. Soon, I realized it was not just the living room. The hallways, the kitchen, even the garden fence. No measurement would stay the same for more than a day. Compulsively, I tore through closets and crawl spaces expecting to find some explanation. I found none. Until one rainy Thursday, when the power went out mid-afternoon and I lit candles to finish a project. In the flickering light, I noticed a faint seam on the dining room wall. Curious, I pried away the paneling with a flathead screwdriver and discovered a hidden recess. Inside were notebooks, dozens and dozens of them, stacked neatly in rows, and each one labeled only by years. The earliest was from 1974, the latest from 2019. The handwriting changed slightly with each notebook, but certain numbers and doodles remained consistent, strange spirals drawn beside measurements, and what seemed to be mathematical equations annotated in dense, sharp script. Turning the notebook's pages, I saw records kept by different hands, presumably previous owners, each recounting erratic measurements and shifting shapes. One entry from 1978 described how the kitchen gained 3 square feet overnight, making the east wall bulge out into the yard. Another notebook, dated 1992, told of cabinets that vanished or relocated. A more recent volume, 2018, featured graphs mapping geometry variance over time and meticulously detailed changes. The writers were trying not only to record the anomalies, but to understand them. Diagrams laid out patterns and cycles, theories of space recursion or stable loops, and memory knots. I called the property manager, a soft-spoken retiree named Ed. I asked him point blank if he knew anything about the house's geometry. He gave a nervous laugh and claimed old colonial houses sometimes play tricks, though he admitted, almost offhandedly, that this particular address had changed owners more than 20 times. "People say it's bad luck," Ed murmured. "But look at it this way," he said. "If you can live here, you'll never find a house with more character." I hung up, feeling neither reassured nor interested in character. That night, driven by anxiety and mounting curiosity, I started mapping the entire house. Each room, every doorway, even the attic and basement, every measurement recorded daily. The house grew and shrank inexplicably. One day the office was wider by 6 inches, the next it narrowed by 4. The walls themselves shifted so smoothly, so subtly, that if I had not kept daily logs, I would have doubted myself. Then the dreams began. At first, just fragments, corridors that stretched impossibly long, doors that led back to themselves, spirals painted on the ceiling that spun faster the longer I stared. Sometimes I would wake up in a different room from where I fell asleep. One morning, I found myself in the hallway, lying beside my open notebooks with new numbers scrawled on their pages, numbers I did not remember writing. I began to lose chunks of time, whole afternoons spent wandering the house, recording measurements, seeing impossible shapes reflected in the windows. I reached out to my neighbor, a 60-year-old woman named Louise, who had lived in Dillsburg since childhood. When she heard my address, her face tightened. She told me the house had always been odd, that her aunt used to say, "It grows when nobody's looking." She shared stories of vanished objects, rooms that rearranged themselves, and a boy who supposedly appeared and vanished in the garden 50 years before. Louise's warnings were gentle but firm. "If you feel the house listening," she said, "lock your bedroom door." Desperate for answers, I took pictures of every wall, ceiling, and floor, uploading images to architectural forums in hopes someone might recognize evidence of shifting foundations or structural tampering. The replies were always the same: no tampering, no physical reason for what I described. A few suggested mold and hallucinations, or advised I see a doctor. Others asked for more details. Someone even requested copies of my notebooks. Nobody could explain how space itself could change so subtly, yet so consistently. Frustrated, I searched the attic, half convinced I would find more journals or secrets. What I found instead was even stranger. A spiral carved into the center of the floorboards, marked with numbers that echoed those found in the hidden notebooks. The spiral looked old and weathered, its groove worn from decades of something. Footsteps, perhaps, or objects dragged in perpetual circles. Instinctively, I stepped into the center of the spiral. For a moment, everything seemed to tilt. The attic grew colder, the air heavy and stale. The floorboards beneath my feet vibrated, humming with a deep, steady rhythm. I stood there, paralyzed, until a crash from downstairs broke the trance. Running back to the first floor, I found a picture frame had fallen off the wall. The frame held an old photograph of the house, one I did not recall seeing before. Curious, I examined the photo. It showed the house as it appeared in the late 1800s, larger, grander, with 4 chimneys, where today there were only 2. The angle of the roof was steeper, the garden wilder, choked by trees that no longer grew on the property. On the back, in faded pencil, was written, "There is no true edge. Only the center remembers." That night, everything accelerated. I measured the living room at midnight, 13 feet, 11 inches. At 2 in the morning, it was 15 feet. I saw shadows darting across the walls, and at one point, every door in the house slammed shut in unison, shaking the ancient glass. My books and papers rearranged themselves. Scribbles appeared in my notebooks in what looked like my handwriting, but the words made no sense. Loops within loops. The sum is always 0. Do not leave the center. I could feel the house pulsing around me, geometry imploding and reforming. Surrendering to fatigue and fear, I decided I had to leave. I packed a suitcase and tried to exit through the front door, but the lock jammed, twisting so violently the key snapped in my hand. The back door was jammed with furniture. Not my furniture, but antiques I had never seen before. Panicked, I fled up the stairs, seeking any exit, only to find the windows sealed with thick, grimy boards nailed from outside. The attic spiral glowed faintly in the darkness. and somewhere below, I heard footsteps echoing from rooms that should have been empty. It was then I realized the house was aware, watching, responding to my actions, contracting when I tried to escape, expanding when I surrendered. In those feverish hours, I began to piece together what the previous owners had tried to warn me. This house did not simply contain rooms and corridors. It contained memory, self-awareness, a recursive architecture that folded itself through time, storing fragments of each person who lived there. Measurement and memory were its blood. I abandoned my suitcase and staggered to the attic, where I pressed myself into the spiral center. The world blurred, as if the house was recalibrating around me. I felt all the tenants before me, a litany of names written in hundreds of hidden notebooks, each returning to the spiral, each trying to measure the edge. As the floor vibrated faster, I saw flashes, children playing in rooms that spun themselves into knots, a woman sewing in a parlor that shifted walls day by day, men frantically charting geometry and aging overnight. Nobody left without leaving a piece behind. It was dawn before the doors unlocked. Light flooded through the newly exposed windows. I stumbled out, blinking at the sun and the normalcy of the waking world. Louise found me sitting on her porch and brought me coffee. She did not press for details. "You lasted longer than most," she said. "The house needs to remember. That is all." The next week, I left Dillsburg for good. I sent scanned copies of my notebooks to architectural researchers, never hearing back. Months later, I received one reply, a short note from another former tenant. "It is always the spiral. Measure nothing. Remember everything." Even now, when I close my eyes, I see corridors folding in on themselves, doors opening into impossible rooms, numbers that refuse to stay still. The house in Dillsburg still stands, waiting for a new tenant, growing and shrinking as memory and time pass through its walls. I do not know if I left a piece of myself there, or if the house simply lent me a piece of itself. Some places do not abide by the rules we know. Some were built to remember, and in their geometry, we become the stories they need to keep growing. Urban exploration had been my hobby since college, something about abandoned places that pulled me in like gravity. I was 26, working freelance graphic design from my apartment in Harrisburg, and spending most weekends with my camera documenting the bones of Pennsylvania's industrial past. The textile mills were my favorite. Those massive brick structures with broken windows and floors carpeted in pigeon feathers and rust. Places where you could still see the ghosts of what America used to make. My Instagram had maybe 3,000 followers who appreciated the aesthetic of decay, the way light filtered through collapsed roofs, the poetry of machinery left to rot. I had explored maybe 40 different sites across central Pennsylvania, always careful, always alone, always aware that trespassing charges were a possibility. But urban explorers called it the acceptable risk of documenting history before it disappeared completely. The mill on the outskirts of Harrisburg had been on my list for months, a 4-story red brick monster that had operated from 1892 until 1974, producing textiles for military contracts and civilian markets. It sat behind a rusted chain-link fence off Old Paxton Road, surrounded by overgrown lots, and the kind of industrial wasteland that nobody bothered to redevelop because the soil was probably toxic, and the cleanup costs would bankrupt anyone foolish enough to try. I had driven past it dozens of times, always meaning to stop, always finding an excuse not to. Something about the building felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. But in early May, I finally convinced myself that feeling was just nerves. Just the usual hesitation before entering an unknown space. I went on a Saturday afternoon, parked my car a quarter-mile away in an abandoned lot behind a closed auto body shop, and walked in carrying my camera, flashlight, and a backpack with water and basic first aid supplies. The fence had a section that had been pulled back by previous explorers, creating an easy entry point. And within 5 minutes, I was standing at the main entrance where the loading dock doors hung open like a mouth. The smell hit me immediately. Not the usual mustiness of abandoned buildings, but something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. I pulled my respirator mask from my backpack, the kind painters use, and fitted it over my face before stepping inside. The first floor was exactly what I expected. Massive open spaces where machinery had once stood, now just concrete pads with bolt holes and oil stains. Broken windows let in shafts of afternoon light that illuminated drifts of debris, old paperwork, wooden pallets, and the skeletons of office furniture. I spent maybe an hour photographing the textures, the patterns of decay, the way nature was reclaiming the space through vines that pushed through cracks in the walls. It was the second floor that started to feel different. The layout was more compartmentalized, smaller, rooms that might have been offices or quality control stations, and in one of them I found filing cabinets that had been left behind, their drawers hanging open and emptied except for a few folders in the very back of the bottom drawer of the last cabinet. The folders contained medical records, which seemed strange for a textile mill. Worker health assessments, injury reports, routine checkups, all dated between 1958 and 1972. I flipped through them with growing confusion because the assessments included tests that seemed far too detailed for industrial medicine. Neurological evaluations, psychological profiles, detailed blood work tracking things like serotonin and dopamine levels, even notes about workers' responses to audio stimuli at specific frequencies. One file belonged to a man named Robert Kellerman, age 34 in 1965, who had worked as a loom operator for 6 years. The medical notes documented a progressive decline in his cognitive function, memory loss, personality changes, all attributed to something called textile lung syndrome, which I knew was a real condition caused by inhaling cotton and fabric fibers. But the treatment recommendations were bizarre, including scheduled exposure to what the doctor called therapeutic sound environments and participation in mandatory wellness programs that involved sitting in specially designed rooms for an hour before and after each shift. I photographed every page, my hands trembling slightly because something about this felt deeply wrong, then continued exploring. The third floor had more of the same empty spaces and broken windows, but also areas where the walls were covered in strange acoustic tiles, geometric patterns that seemed to have no functional purpose. In one large room, I found what looked like remnants of some kind of audio equipment. Speakers mounted in the ceiling, wiring that ran through conduits along the walls, all of it corroded and barely recognizable. I was photographing the speaker system when I heard it, a low hum that seemed to come from beneath the floor, rhythmic and steady like industrial machinery. I froze, listening, trying to determine if it was real or just my imagination filling the silence with phantom sounds. The hum continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. And in the silence that followed, I heard something else. Mechanical clicking, the kind of sound old looms would make, metal shuttles moving back and forth through warp and weft. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out, but curiosity is a powerful thing, and I convinced myself that maybe there was still power to the building. Maybe the city had not shut everything down properly. Maybe what I was hearing was just old electrical systems shorting out. I found the stairwell to the basement, a narrow concrete shaft that descended into complete darkness, and started down with my flashlight, cutting a weak cone through the black. The air got colder with each step, and that chemical smell intensified until I could taste it even through my respirator. At the bottom, I found myself in a corridor with doors on both sides, most of them locked or rusted shut, but one at the very end stood slightly ajar. Inside was a workshop, or what had been a workshop, dominated by 4 industrial looms that looked like they dated from the 1950s or earlier. They were massive machines, all metal and gears and wooden frames, and they should not have been operational. But as I stood there shining my light across them, one of the looms started moving. The shuttle began sliding back and forth, the warp threads tensing and relaxing, the whole machine operating with smooth mechanical precision, even though there was no visible power source, no electrical connection, nothing to explain how it was running. I stepped closer, mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. And that is when I saw what the loom was weaving. The fabric emerging from the machine was not cotton or wool or any textile I recognized. It was pink and wet, glistening in my flashlight beam. And as I looked closer, I realized with horror that it was organic. Flesh woven together with thread, blood vessels running through the weave like veins through living tissue. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera, and turned to run. But the other 3 looms had started operating, all of them weaving the same impossible fabric. And I could see now that the machines themselves had been modified, biological material integrated into the metal frames. What looked like muscle tissue wrapped around gears, tendons connecting moving parts. The looms were not just machines anymore. They were hybrids, half mechanical and half alive, and they were producing sheets of living flesh that piled on the floor in wet, pulsing heaps. I ran for the door, my respirator fogging up from my panicked breathing. And as I reached the corridor, I heard a sound behind me that I will never forget. A voice, human but distorted, coming from somewhere within the workshop, saying words I could not quite understand, but that filled me with such primal terror that I did not stop running until I was out of the building and back at my car. I sat in the driver's seat shaking for maybe 20 minutes before I could hold my phone steady enough to call anyone. I tried 911 first, tried to explain what I had found, but the dispatcher seemed confused and kept asking if I was reporting an injury or a crime in progress. When I insisted they needed to send someone to the mill, that there was something wrong there, something dangerous, she asked if I had been trespassing on private property and whether I needed medical attention for potential drug use. I hung up, frustrated and scared, and instead called my friend Derek, who worked as a freelance journalist for the Harrisburg Patriot News. He met me at a coffee shop an hour later, and I showed him the photos on my camera, the medical files, the workshop, the looms, weaving, flesh. Derek stared at the images for a long time without speaking, then asked if I would be willing to go on record about what I found. I said yes, absolutely. And over the next 3 weeks, we put together an investigation. Derek dug through county records and discovered that the mill had held several military contracts during the Cold War, not just for textiles, but for experimental materials research under Department of Defense funding. He found sealed court documents from a 1966 lawsuit filed by former workers, claiming they had been subjected to medical experiments without consent, psychological manipulation, and exposure to hazardous materials. The case had been settled out of court with a gag order, and the mill had closed shortly after. We reached out to some of the surviving former employees, now in their 70s and 80s, and 3 of them agreed to talk anonymously. They described being required to sit in soundproof rooms before shifts where they would listen to recordings that made them feel peaceful, compliant, willing to work longer hours without complaint. They talked about co-workers who changed, who became different people, who lost memories or developed strange medical conditions that doctors could not explain. Derek published the story in August, and it created a minor stir locally. The State Environmental Agency sent inspectors to the mill and found evidence of hazardous materials, but nothing that specifically corroborated what I had photographed. The workshop I had found was empty when they searched it, the looms gone. No biological material, just water damage and rust. The official explanation was that I had likely seen decomposing animal carcasses, maybe rats or raccoons that had died in the building and been colonized by mold or fungi that created the illusion of something more sinister. Derek pushed back, pointed to the medical files, and the worker testimonies. But without physical evidence, the story died within a few weeks, replaced by newer scandals and more pressing local news. I stopped doing urban exploration after that. Could not bring myself to enter another abandoned building. Could not shake the feeling that some places are abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with economics or changing industries. My camera sits in a closet now, unused, and I have moved twice since then, first to Mechanicsburg and then to Camp Hill, always choosing apartments with lots of neighbors and good lighting. But I still get messages sometimes, late at night, from anonymous accounts that send me photos of textile mills across Pennsylvania, asking if I have been to this one or that one, hinting that what I found in Harrisburg was not unique, that the experiments did not stop in 1976, that they just moved underground into basements and sublevels that do not appear on any blueprints. I never respond, but I also never delete the messages. Some part of me knows that what I saw was real, that those looms were weaving something terrible, and that somewhere in Pennsylvania's industrial ruins, the work continues even now, in darkness, producing fabric from flesh and machines that remember what it means to be alive. Family mythology is a strange thing. Those stories that get passed down through generations until nobody can quite remember what is true and what has been embellished by time and repeated retellings. I grew up hearing about my Aunt Diane, my father's older sister, who supposedly changed overnight in 1983, went from being a normal high school senior with college plans to someone who barely spoke, who stared at walls for hours, who eventually dropped out and worked minimum wage jobs until she died in a car accident in 1991. My father always said it was drugs, that the 80s were rough and Diane had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, but my grandmother would shake her head and say it was something else, something that happened that winter that nobody wanted to talk about. I turned 32 in March and had been working as a research librarian at Penn State Harrisburg for 6 years, which meant I had access to archives and databases most people never see. And after my grandmother passed away in January, I found myself thinking about Aunt Diane more and more, wondering what really happened to her. Cleaning out my grandmother's house in a small town called Mount Union, population barely 2,400 Taians, I found boxes of Diane's belongings that had been stored in the attic for decades. Journals, school papers, photographs, and buried at the bottom of one box, a collection of cassette tapes labeled with dates from December 1982 through February 1983. The tapes were recordings of a local radio station, WPTG 104.7, which I had never heard of despite growing up in the area. My grandmother had scribbled notes on some of the tape cases, phrases like, "This is what she listened to," and played constantly, volume low, all night. I borrowed a cassette player from the university's media archives department and spent an evening in my apartment listening to the recordings, expecting to hear typical early 80s radio programming, pop music, and advertisements, and maybe some local news that would give me context for what Diane had been going through. What I heard instead was deeply unsettling. The programming on WPTG was structured like a normal radio station, with a host who called himself The Shepherd, and segments that included music, weather updates, and community announcements. But the music was wrong. Songs I had never heard before with lyrics that repeated strange phrases, words that seemed to shift and overlap in ways that made them difficult to understand. The weather reports included information that made no sense, temperatures given in decimal points to 3 places, wind directions described using compass bearings that did not exist, barometric pressure readings that defied meteorological possibility. And the community announcements were the strangest part. Messages directed at specific individuals using only first names and birth years, telling them to remember their appointments, to continue their treatments, to trust the process, and embrace the clarity that was coming. One announcement specifically mentioned Diane asking Diane M., born 1965, to confirm her participation in the evening sessions and reminding her that her progress was being monitored for optimal adjustment. I played that section 3 times, my hands shaking slightly, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that there must have been other Dianes born in 1965 in the listening area. But my grandmother's notes confirmed it was about my aunt, and as I listened to more tapes, I found additional references to her, always vague, always framed in the language of wellness and community health, but increasingly specific about scheduling and expectations. By February 1983, the announcements were directing Diane to report for her final integration session and congratulating her on completing Phase 3 of the Community Enhancement Program. I started researching WPTG using the university's newspaper archives and historical databases, and what I found was fragmentary but deeply concerning. The station had operated from 1978 until 1984, licensed as a low-power community radio station serving a roughly 20-mile radius around Mount Union. The license had been held by something called the Central Pennsylvania Wellness Initiative, a non-profit organization that claimed to provide mental health and community support services. Local newspaper archives showed that WPTG had advertised extensively in 1981 and 1982, encouraging residents to tune in for programming designed to reduce stress, improve sleep, and foster community connection. Several articles from the Mount Union Times mentioned that hundreds of local residents had written letters praising the station for helping them overcome anxiety, depression, and insomnia, crediting the shepherd's voice and the carefully curated music selections with transforming their lives. But there were also strange gaps in the coverage. No articles about the station appeared after March 1983, despite it continuing to broadcast until 1984, according to FCC records. I found references to a lawsuit filed in 1985 by a group of former listeners claiming they had been subjected to psychological manipulation and audio-based mind control experiments. But the case had been sealed and dismissed, with all parties bound by a confidentiality agreement. The Central Pennsylvania Wellness Initiative had dissolved in 1986, and the individuals listed as its board members had either died or moved out of state. I managed to track down one former board member, a man named Gerald Stevenson, who was living in a nursing home in Altoona. And when I called and mentioned WPTG, there was a long silence before he told me he could not discuss it, that he had signed papers, that some things were better left buried. I contacted my father and asked him directly about Diane and the radio station. He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. He told me that Diane had become obsessed with WPTG in the winter of her senior year, that she would sit in her bedroom with the radio on low volume for hours every evening, wearing headphones, writing in notebooks that she never let anyone see. My grandmother had been worried, but Diane insisted it was just music, just a local station that helped her relax and focus. By January 1983, Diane had started attending meetings at a community center in town, something the station had organized, wellness sessions where participants would sit in a darkened room and listen to recordings while instructors talked them through relaxation exercises. My father had driven by the community center once and seen maybe 40 people inside, all sitting perfectly still in rows of chairs, all wearing headphones, all staring straight ahead with blank expressions. He said that after Diane completed the program in February, she was different in ways he still could not fully articulate. She was not violent or obviously disturbed, but something fundamental had changed. She spoke in a monotone, rarely made eye contact, seemed to have lost interest in everything she had previously cared about. Her handwriting changed, became more uniform and mechanical. She stopped making plans, stopped expressing opinions, just existed in this passive state of compliance. My grandmother had taken her to doctors, therapists, even a neurologist, but nobody could find anything physically wrong. The official diagnosis was depression with dissociative features, and Diane had spent the next 8 years working retail jobs and living in a small apartment until she drove her car into a concrete barrier on Route 22 at 2 in the morning. A single vehicle accident that the police ruled accidental, but my grandmother always believed was something else. I spent weeks digging deeper, filing Freedom of Information requests with every agency I could think of, trying to find documentation of what the Central Pennsylvania Wellness Initiative had actually been doing. Most requests were denied or returned with heavily redacted documents, but I finally received a partial file from the Department of Health and Human Services that included a 1984 internal memo discussing concerns about unlicensed psychological research being conducted in rural Pennsylvania communities. The memo referenced audio-based conditioning experiments designed to test the effectiveness of subliminal messaging and frequency modulation on behavioral modification, and it mentioned that the research had been funded through a grant from a private foundation, with ties to defense contractors researching psychological warfare techniques during the Cold War. The memo stated that approximately 300 residents across 3 counties had participated in the WPTG programs between 1981 and 1983, and that follow-up assessments in 1985 had found statistically significant changes in personality profiles, memory function, and emotional responsiveness among participants. The research had been shut down not because of ethical concerns, but because the funding had been redirected to other projects and the principal investigators had moved to different positions. The participants had never been informed that they were part of an experiment, and the confidentiality agreement signed after the lawsuit ensured that the full scope of what happened would never become public knowledge. I tried to find other families who had been affected, posting in local history forums and reaching out to people who had lived in Mount Union during the early 80s. I received maybe a dozen responses, all anonymous, all describing similar experiences with family members who had changed after listening to WPTG, who had attended the wellness sessions, who had become hollow versions of themselves. One woman told me her brother had been a talented musician who stopped playing entirely after completing the program, said the music in his head had been replaced with something else, something he could not explain but that made him feel peaceful and empty. Another man described his mother becoming obsessed with routine after the sessions, following the same schedule every day with mechanical precision, never deviating, never expressing frustration or joy or any emotion beyond mild contentment. I still have the cassette tapes stored in a locked drawer in my apartment, and sometimes late at night I think about listening to them again, trying to understand what it was that changed my aunt and hundreds of others. But I'm afraid of what I might hear, afraid that whatever frequencies and subliminal messages were embedded in those recordings might still be active, still capable of altering something fundamental in the brain. The station has been off the air for over 40 years. The people who ran it are mostly dead or silent, and the communities that were affected have moved on, absorbed the losses and the changed family members into their collective memory as just another tragedy from the past. But I know what happened was not an accident, not a failed wellness program, but a deliberate experiment in how easily human consciousness can be manipulated with the right combination of sound and repetition and isolation. My aunt was not a victim of drugs or depression. She was a victim of something far more calculated, and the fact that nobody was ever held accountable, that the research was simply abandoned rather than exposed, means it could happen again, is probably happening somewhere else right now, in another small town, with another radio station, and another group of people who just want to feel a little bit better and do not realize what they are giving up in exchange for that artificial peace. Night shift at a gas station in a dying Pennsylvania coal town is not a career. It is what happens when all the better options have already left on the interstate headed somewhere else. I was 28, living in what locals called the Valley, a scatter of houses and abandoned storefronts maybe 12 miles outside Shamokin, where the mines had closed in the 1960s and taken most of the population with them. The quick stop where I worked sat at the intersection of two rural routes that barely saw traffic after dark, surrounded by hills scarred with old strip mines and forests that had grown back wild and thick over the industrial wreckage. I worked Thursday through Monday, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, pumping gas for truckers and the occasional lost tourist, selling cigarettes and lottery tickets to the same dozen regulars who showed up at predictable intervals throughout the night. It paid $9 an hour, plus whatever pennies people left in the tip jar, barely enough to cover rent on my trailer and keep my 10-year-old Civic running. But jobs in the Valley were scarce enough that you took what you could get and did not complain. Gerald was one of my regulars, showed up every Friday around 2 in the morning for coffee and a pack of Marlboro Reds, always paid in exact change, always made the same small talk about the weather and how the Steelers were doing. He was maybe 60, thin in that wiry way old coal miners get, with hands that shook slightly when he counted out his quarters and a cough that sounded like gravel rattling in a can. He told me once he had worked at the Burnside mine until it closed in 1963, had been doing odd jobs ever since, living in a cabin up on Shamokin Mountain that his father had built in the 1940s. He seemed harmless, lonely in the way a lot of old men in the Valley were lonely, their wives dead or gone, their children moved away to places with actual futures, just counting down the days until the black lung or the diabetes or the simple accumulated weight of a hard life finally took them. Gerald stopped coming in mid-October, the first Friday he missed. I figured he was sick or had decided to quit smoking, both reasonable explanations that did not particularly concern me. The second Friday I noticed his absence more consciously, wondered if maybe he had died and nobody had thought to mention it, because that is how things worked in the Valley. People disappeared, and you only found out weeks later through third-hand gossip at the post office. The third Friday, I asked another regular, a truck driver named Ray, who had lived in the area his whole life, if he knew anything about Gerald. Ray got quiet for a moment, then said he had not seen Gerald in a while either, that the cabin up on Shamokin Mountain had been dark the last few times he drove past it. But that was not necessarily unusual, because Gerald sometimes went to visit family in West Virginia. By early November, I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Gerald had been so consistent for the 2 years I'd worked the night shift, his absence felt like a glitch in the routine, a missing piece that made the whole pattern feel unstable. On a Thursday night, when traffic was particularly dead, I decided to drive up Shamokin Mountain on my lunch break around 3 in the morning, telling myself I just wanted to check if Gerald was okay, that it was the neighborly thing to do, even though I barely knew him beyond our brief Friday morning conversations. The cabin was easy to find because Ray had mentioned it was near the old entrance to the Burnside mine, a gated tunnel that had been sealed with concrete back in the 70s. I parked my Civic on the shoulder and walked up the dirt driveway with my flashlight, calling Gerald's name and feeling increasingly foolish for making the trip. The cabin was dark, no vehicles in the driveway, no smoke from the chimney. I knocked on the door several times with no response, then tried the handle and found it unlocked, which was not unusual in the Valley where people still trusted their neighbors, or at least figured there was nothing worth stealing. Inside, the cabin looked like Gerald had stepped out for a minute and never come back. Coffee cup on the kitchen table, still half full, newspapers dated October 18th spread out on the couch, television remote sitting on the arm of a recliner, his coat hung by the door, his boots lined up neatly on a mat, his truck keys in a bowl on the counter. It looked like he had simply vanished mid-routine, and standing in that silent cabin with my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I felt the first real stab of fear that something terrible had happened. I called the state police the next morning after my shift ended, told them about Gerald's disappearance and the strange condition of his cabin, A trooper named Michaels showed up at my trailer around 2 in the afternoon, took my statement, and promised they would do a welfare check. He called me back 3 days later and said they had searched the cabin and the surrounding area but found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest Gerald had not simply decided to leave voluntarily. When I pressed him about the abandoned belongings, the coffee cup, the fact that Gerald's truck and keys were still there, Michaels got defensive and said people leave their lives behind all the time, especially in economically depressed areas where depression and substance abuse were common. He suggested that maybe Gerald had gotten a ride from someone, maybe had a medical emergency and was in a hospital somewhere without identification, that there were a dozen reasonable explanations and I should not worry myself over someone who was probably fine. But I kept thinking about Gerald, could not stop replaying our conversations, looking for clues I might have missed. I started asking around the valley, talking to other people who knew him, and discovered something strange. Gerald was not the only one. In the past 6 months, at least 4 other men had disappeared from the area, all of them older, all of them former miners, all of them living alone in cabins or trailers scattered throughout the hills. Nobody had reported them missing officially because everyone assumed they had either died and not been found yet, or had simply left for somewhere warmer, somewhere with better health care, somewhere that was not slowly collapsing in on itself like the valley. But when I started connecting the dots, talking to their few remaining friends and neighbors, the pattern became clear. They had all vanished without warning, leaving behind their belongings, their vehicles, their entire lives, as if they had been plucked out of existence mid-sentence. On a cold Sunday night in late November, I drove back up to Shamokin Mountain, this time with a better flashlight and my phone fully charged. I parked near the sealed mine entrance and started walking the old access roads, following paths that miners had used decades ago to reach the deeper shafts and strip pits. The forest had reclaimed most of it, but you could still see traces of industrial infrastructure, rusted tracks, collapsed equipment sheds, piles of slag that would never fully decompose. About a mile from Gerald's cabin, I found a section of ground that looked disturbed, freshly dug and then filled back in, the earth darker and looser than the surrounding soil. I started digging with a stick, then with my hands when the stick broke, and within 10 minutes, I hit something that was not dirt. It was fabric, clothing, and as I pulled away more soil, I saw an arm, then a shoulder, then Gerald's face, eyes closed, skin pale and waxy in death. I stumbled backward, fell hard on the frozen ground, and sat there shaking for maybe 5 minutes before I could make my hands steady enough to call 911. The state police arrived within an hour, along with the county coroner and a forensic team that spent the rest of the night excavating the site. They found not just Gerald, but 3 other bodies buried in a rough line along the old mine road, all men, all matching the descriptions of the other disappeared miners I had been asking about. All of them had been killed execution style, single gunshot to the back of the head, then buried in shallow graves that would have gone undiscovered if I had not been looking. The investigation that followed revealed something even more disturbing. The murders had been methodical, targeted. Someone had been systematically killing former miners who lived alone, who would not be immediately missed, whose disappearances could easily be attributed to the natural attrition of a dying community. The state police brought in a detective from Harrisburg, a woman named Chen, who specialized in cold cases and serial crimes, and she spent weeks interviewing everyone in the valley, collecting evidence, building a profile of the killer. She told me during one of my interviews that this was not random violence, that someone had been selecting victims carefully, studying their routines, knowing exactly when and how to strike without leaving witnesses. She asked me if I had noticed anyone new in the area, anyone asking questions about the miners, anyone who seemed out of place at the gas station during my night shifts. I thought back through months of faces, truckers and tourists, and the handful of locals who still stopped by after midnight, and I could not identify anyone suspicious. But then I remembered something small, a detail that had not seemed important at the time. About 3 months earlier, a man had started showing up semi-regularly, maybe once every 2 weeks, always late at night, always paying cash for gas and coffee. He drove a dark-colored pickup, maybe a Ford or a Chevy. Nothing distinctive, and he barely spoke beyond thanking me for the change. But I remembered him because he would sit in his truck in the parking lot for 20 or 30 minutes after filling up, just sitting there in the dark. And once when I had glanced out the window, I saw him watching the gas station, watching me, with this focused intensity that had made me uncomfortable enough to lock the door until he left. I described him to Detective Chen, gave her the approximate dates he had been there, and she pulled the security camera footage from the quick stop, grainy black and white images that barely showed details but confirmed my memory. The man appeared in the footage on 7 different nights between August and October, always arriving between 1 and 3 in the morning, always alone. Chen ran the vehicle description through databases and cross-referenced it with similar crimes in other rural Pennsylvania counties, and what she found was chilling. There had been similar patterns in 3 other regions over the past 5 years. Clusters of unsolved murders targeting elderly men living in isolated areas, always in communities devastated by industrial collapse, always victims who would not be immediately missed. The cases were spread across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and southern Ohio, maybe 20 victims in total, and the working theory was that a single killer had been moving through dying coal towns, exploiting the social breakdown and lack of resources to commit murders that were either never investigated or never connected. They never caught him. Detective Chen worked the case for another 6 months, followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, but the man from the security footage never returned to the valley, and his vehicle was never identified. The case went cold, filed away with dozens of other unsolved murders in rural Pennsylvania, and life in the valley continued its slow collapse. I quit the quick stop 3 months after finding Gerald's body. Could not stand the night shifts anymore, the isolation, the constant feeling that I was being watched through the darkness beyond the fluorescent lights. I moved to Pottsville, got a day job at a grocery store, tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy, but I still think about Gerald sometimes, about our Friday morning conversations, about how he had been so consistent, so reliably alive, until suddenly he was not. And I think about the other 4 men buried on Shamokin Mountain, all of them forgotten by a world that had already moved on, killed by someone who understood that in places like the valley, the disappeared are just another form of expected attrition, another name that stops showing up until nobody remembers to ask why. Photographers rarely tell the whole truth. Images are slices, little frames that suggest a story, but the real events, a place's memory, its secrets, are always bigger than anything captured in a single shot. When I got the assignment to photograph eastern Pennsylvania's disappearing coal towns, I thought it would be like so many before. Faded homes, the empty factory shells, a population persistent despite everything. What the editor of the magazine wanted was nostalgia, a visual lament for a lost era, maybe a portrait of an old-timer outside a general store. That is what I intended to find in the Mountain Valley settlement of Brier Hollow, a town so small you will not see it on a map, buried north of Pottsville, where the paved roads run out and the mountains rise and fall in steep folded waves of pine. The invitation came from Aaron, an acquaintance who ran a local historical society in Schuylkill County and claimed he had contacts in every patch, mining village, and church social in the region. When I called him ahead of the trip, he sounded almost urgent. "You will not just photograph buildings here, Reuben. Talk to them. Listen," he said. In that way local guardians of history sometimes do. They speak about the dead as if they're just in the next room. I arrived in mid-October. Hills already turning, fog thick in the mornings. The first hours were predictable. Aaron walked me past a boarded Union Hall, past a jumble of modest houses pitched at odd angles on the steep hills, and finally to the old breaker, a hulking wooden structure full of black dust and splinters. "This is what built everything here," Aaron murmured. I snapped pictures, capturing the fading murals of miners painted on crumbling concrete, the crooked grave markers clustered near the abandoned Catholic church, and the old slate piles farther up the mountain. But Brier Hollow was stranger than any town I had photographed before. The people were friendly, but almost evasively vague when I asked about the town's population. The same 5 or 6 families appeared everywhere, at the gas station, the single diner, and especially in the storefront bar where I ate most nights. Certain names, though, were missing. I noticed it first when leafing through a 1990s yearbook in the town's historical display. There were notes beside student photos, where they went to college, who they married, but twice a group of siblings simply vanished after sophomore year. No graduation note, no memoriam. Other yearbooks had the same gaps. Houses at the far end of town, intact and beautifully kept, stood empty. Curtains drawn, mailboxes uncollected for years. No one would mention their owners. I finally asked Aaron directly one chilly night while we drank Yuengling at the bar. He looked uncomfortable and glanced at the bartender before replying. 3 families left in '95, he said, voice very low. Just up and vanished, nearly overnight. Was not newspapers, no missing persons, just one day here, next day gone. I assumed at first he meant people simply moved. No forwarding addresses, I asked. Sure, but that happens everywhere. He shook his head. They were here. You'd see them at church, the market, and then not. Homes untouched. Full bowls of apples on the table, clothes on the line. Everything like they meant to come back. My journalistic sense refused to let it go. The next morning, I took a walk on the East Road, away from the center of Brier Hollow, and reached the houses standing so beautifully empty. The grass was cut, windows relatively clean. Through one kitchen window, I saw dishes in a drying rack and a child's backpack abandoned near the door, as though someone had raced out and forgotten everything. No sign of forced entry. Someone still trimmed the rose bushes. No locks. But for politeness, I did not cross the threshold. The silence, more than trespassing law, kept me from stepping inside. I returned to the town library, such as it was. A single room in the community hall given over to Baptist hymnals, mining memoirs, and yellowed copies of the Pottsville Republican. I dug through those for hours, searching for anything on the disappearances. Missing persons, accidents, rumors, nothing. The local paper skipped the crucial week in 1995, with the only issue for that period missing from the bound archive, and the librarian, an elderly woman who claimed she had grown up here, blushed and told me it must have been lost to mildew. Yet when she thought I had gone, I found her speaking in the stacks to someone in a whisper. The only words I could make out were, "They warn you, not at night, not since that year." I wrote the date, October 17th, 1995, in my notebook, and went to the courthouse the next day to see if property documents told a story the news did not. Records showed that the homes in question had never transferred. No one new had moved in, and taxes continued to be paid from a Harrisburg lawyer's trust. That lawyer, when I called, hung up as soon as I said the name Brier Hollow. On my 5th day, I returned to the furthest abandoned house just before sundown, driven by a mixture of journalistic persistence and a foreboding curiosity. The door was still unlocked, and at last I stepped inside. The air was cold and musty, but everything was orderly. Plates set for dinner, mail sorted on the counter. A radio left on the kitchen counter, long dead. The family's photos lined the hallway. A father, mother, daughter, and son smiling on prom night. At the high school football field, at a picnic. All from 1995. In a corner, I found a Polaroid pinned to a bookshelf, not of people, but of the woods behind the house, and, half visible among the trees, a blurred shape. Wrongly tall, too thin, inhuman. The furthest thing from those vintage Halloween photos. Nothing sentimental in that warped silhouette. The house seemed to contract with the dark. As sunset fell, I heard soft scuffling upstairs. Impossible, with floors so warped and rotten that even stray animals would have made more noise. But I could not keep from calling out, "Hello?" hoping against sense or safety to hear a human voice. Instead, just the hush, as if the whole place exhaled. I left quickly, locking up without meaning to, and walked back into town just as porch lights snapped on, one by one, up the main street. At the diner, a waitress, who had seen me leave earlier, watched me enter and asked, "You should not go there after dark." I wanted to demand answers, insist it was my right as a journalist, but the look in her eyes warned me not to. That night, back at my motel, I sorted through all my film. I had shot rolls of the hills, the miners' murals, the empty houses, the photos from the library. When I developed the negatives hours later, there were extra images, blurred frames I did not remember taking, fixed on those empty houses. Figures stood in the shadows behind the curtains, shapes pressed close to windows, indistinct but present. I spent the rest of the night awake, all my lights on, my mind playing and replaying the sound of footsteps above me in that vacant house. Sleep was no longer tempting. The next morning, I went to Aaron's office in the small historical society. He looked more exhausted than I felt, dark circles under his eyes. I told him what I had seen, showed him the photos. Wordlessly, he led me to a locked filing cabinet, hesitated, then opened it with a shaking hand. Inside, thick folders of disappearance reports, deputies' notes, frantic letters from mothers. Every few years, though most from 1967 and then 1995, there had been clusters, all with the same patterns. Full families gone overnight, houses untouched, no explanations, no bodies, nothing but absence. The last letter was dated December 1995. A frantic plea from a woman in Blue Mountain to stop whatever comes from the woods. "Why?" I asked Aaron. "Does nobody say anything? Why do you keep all this buried?" He shrugged. "People get on with it, Reuben, or they leave. Rule here is not to talk about what cannot be fixed. The ones that vanished. Rumor is, if you speak their names in the woods, you disappear with them. I cannot say if it is true, but..." He shook his head. "We keep to the center of town, after dark. Always have, always will." I finished my assignment. Portraits of sunrise over abandoned collieries, children playing in alleys framed by collapsing row houses, the lace curtains of the empty homes. I gave the magazine what it wanted, stark beauty and the elegy of things left behind. But I also kept my negatives, the ones with the shadows and the blurred shapes in the trees. I never published those, never showed them, not even to Aaron. Months later, an envelope arrived for me in Philadelphia. No return address, just my name in block letters. Inside were 3 Polaroids of the missing families, alive, eating in the woods under that same warped tree line. The people did not look scared or hurt. Their faces were calm, if blank, the same way I remembered my aunt after her incident decades ago. There was no writing on the pictures, just a postmark from outside Schuylkill County. No message, no threat, just a proof, if you could call it that disappearing means something different in Brier Hollow. Since that autumn, I've not gone back. The editor asked for updates, more portraits, but I declined. I sometimes check satellite photos of the valley for the houses at the town's edge. They remain beautifully empty. Sometimes, on rainy nights when the city is silent, I look through the negatives and wonder if, next time the woods need someone, the locals will find the courage to ask, or will the houses simply wait, set for supper, until the next family walks out into the tree line and does not come back. Because in Brier Hollow, what disappears is not always forgotten. Sometimes, if you're unlucky, it just waits for someone to come knocking, camera in hand, ready to hear the last story never spoken aloud. Rental houses in the small Appalachian towns of Pennsylvania do not come with disclaimers, just low prices, and landlords who ask few questions. I was 29, working remotely as a medical transcriptionist, and the place I found online looked perfect for someone who needed quiet and cheap rent. The listing described it as a historic home in a small community near the Susquehanna River. 2 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, surrounded by mature trees. The rent was $450 a month, which should have been my first warning, but I had just left a bad relationship in Reading and needed somewhere I could afford on my own while I rebuilt my savings. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Kessler who lived 3 towns over, met me at the property on a gray March afternoon, handed me the keys, and told me the house had been in his family since the 1920s, but nobody had lived in it for almost 18 months because the previous tenant had left suddenly without explanation. The house sat at the end of a gravel lane, white clapboard, with green shutters, a small front porch, and a yard that desperately needed attention. Inside, it smelled like old wood and something faintly medicinal, like camphor or eucalyptus. The rooms were empty except for a few pieces of furniture the previous tenant had abandoned, a kitchen table, a dresser in the smaller bedroom, and oddly, dozens of objects scattered throughout the house that seemed deliberately placed. There were small iron horseshoes nailed above every doorway, hex signs painted on wooden circles and hung in the windows, lines of salt along the windowsills that had hardened into crusts, and bundles of dried herbs tied with red string hanging from nails in the walls. When I asked Mr. Kessler about them, he shrugged and said the previous tenant had been into folk superstitions, Pennsylvania Dutch stuff his own grandmother used to believe in. Nothing to worry about, but I was welcome to remove them if I wanted. I left them up for the first week, partly out of laziness and partly because they gave the house a strange kind of character, like it was protected by generations of accumulated belief. I settled in quickly, set up my workspace in the larger bedroom with my computer and transcription equipment, established a routine of working mornings and early afternoons, then taking walks through the surrounding woods before making dinner, and spending evenings reading or watching shows on my laptop. The neighbors were sparse, the nearest house maybe a quarter mile down the road, and I saw them only occasionally when driving in or out. An elderly couple named the Stoltz-Fuses, who waved but never stopped to chat, and further down, a younger family with small children, who kept to themselves. It was exactly the kind of isolation I thought I wanted after years of living with someone who needed constant interaction and validation. The scratching started on my 8th night in the house. I was in bed, around midnight when I heard it, a rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to come from beneath the floor, like fingernails on wood, or something small trying to claw its way through the boards. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, and I convinced myself it was probably mice or squirrels that had gotten under the house. Nothing unusual for an old structure in a rural area. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same duration, same location directly beneath my bedroom. I mentioned it to Mr. Kessler when I called to ask about pest control, and he said he would have someone come check the crawl space, but nobody ever showed up. And when I called back, he claimed he had left a message with a local exterminator who must have forgotten. By the end of the second week, the scratching had become a nightly occurrence, always starting around midnight, always lasting between 20 and 40 seconds, always in the same spot. I started sleeping in the smaller bedroom to escape it, but the sound followed, or seemed to, appearing now beneath whichever room I occupied. I also began noticing that the protective objects throughout the house, the ones I had left in place, seemed to have shifted. The hex signs in the windows were angled differently. The salt lines had gaps in them that I did not remember making, and one of the iron horseshoes had fallen from above the basement door and was lying on the floor, the nails still embedded in the wood of the doorframe, as if something had pulled it straight down with tremendous force. The basement was the one part of the house I had not fully explored. Mr. Kessler had mentioned it was just storage space, unfinished, nothing worth seeing, and the door was at the back of the kitchen, painted the same white as the walls and easy to overlook. But after the horseshoe incident, I felt compelled to go down there to see if whatever was making the scratching sounds was coming from below. The stairs were narrow and steep, no handrail, and they descended into a damp stone-walled space that smelled like earth and mildew. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, providing minimal light that did little to penetrate the shadows in the corners. The floor was hard-packed dirt, and I could see where previous occupants had stored things, outlines in the dust where boxes or furniture had once sat. But what caught my attention immediately were the walls. Every surface, all 4 stone walls, was covered in carved symbols, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping and layered as if multiple people over multiple generations had added to them. I recognized some as hex signs, the folk magic symbols Pennsylvania Dutch communities used for protection, but others were stranger, geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long, spirals that seemed to pull your eye inward, and phrases carved in Old German that I could not read. In one corner, someone had built what looked like a shrine, a small wooden shelf holding candles that had melted into puddles of wax, more dried herbs, and a collection of animal bones arranged in patterns I did not understand. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, photographing everything with my phone, trying to process what I was seeing. This was not casual superstition or folk decoration. This was something done with purpose, with fear, with the kind of desperation that comes from believing something terrible is being kept at bay only through constant vigilance. I noticed that all the symbols seemed to point toward, or radiate from, the far corner of the basement, the darkest section where the single bulb barely reached. Walking closer, I saw that the dirt floor in that corner had been disturbed, dug up, and filled back in multiple times based on the different layers of soil visible in the small depression. And directly above that spot, on the stone foundation wall, someone had painted in white letters the words, "Sealed, 1887, do not open." That night, the scratching was different. Instead of the usual 30 seconds, it continued for hours, starting at midnight and not stopping until dawn. And it was not just scratching anymore, but rhythmic pounding, like something was hammering against the underside of the floorboards with systematic determination. I sat in the living room, with every light on, too terrified to sleep, and watched as the few remaining protective objects in the house, the salt lines, the hex signs, began to visibly deteriorate, the salt crumbling into powder, the painted symbols on the wooden circles fading as if being erased by an invisible hand. By the time the sun came up, every protective object in the house had been destroyed or rendered useless, and the pounding from below had finally stopped, replaced by a silence that felt somehow worse. I called Mr. Kessler at 7 in the morning and demanded to know what he had not told me about the house. There was a long pause, and then he sighed and said that the property had a history, that his grandmother used to tell stories about something sealed in the foundation when the house was built, something from the old country that the original settlers had brought with them and then tried to contain. He said previous tenants had complained about noises, about feeling watched, about things in the basement, but most people either did not believe in such things or convinced themselves it was just an old house settling. The tenant before me had been different, had taken the folklore seriously, had spent their entire time there maintaining the protective barriers and adding new ones. When they left, they had told Mr. Kessler that the seals were weakening, that the house needed someone who understood what they were doing, someone with knowledge of the old ways, not just a random renter who would ignore the warnings. I asked him what would happen if the seals failed completely, if whatever was down there got out. He said his grandmother believed it was a hunger, not a physical thing, but a spiritual one, something that fed on the life energy of anyone living above it. The house had been built specifically to contain it, with the basement as a kind of cage, and as long as the protective symbols were maintained and strengthened, it remained dormant. But if left unattended, if the barriers broke down, it would begin to wake, to test the boundaries, to scratch and claw and eventually find a way through. He told me I should leave, that he would refund my deposit and the rent, that I did not want to be there when whatever was sealed beneath finally broke free. I packed my belongings that afternoon and was out of the house by evening. As I loaded the last box into my car, one of my neighbors, Mrs. Stoltzfus, came walking down the gravel lane and stopped at the edge of the yard. She looked at the house, then at me, and said in a thick Pennsylvania Dutch accent that I was smart to leave, that the house had stood for over 100 years, but it would not stand forever, that some things buried do not stay buried, and some hungers cannot be satisfied. She told me that 6 families had lived there in the 8 years before me, none staying longer than 6 months, and that the land itself was cursed, had been cursed long before the house was built, back when it was just forest, and whatever lived in the ground below was free to roam. I moved to Harrisburg, found a small apartment in a modern building with thin walls and noisy neighbors, and I have never been more grateful for the sounds of human life surrounding me. I still have the photographs I took of the basement, the carved symbols, and the painted warning. And sometimes, late at night, I scroll through them and wonder if Mr. Kessler ever found someone willing to maintain the seals, or if the house still sits empty at the end of that gravel lane, the barriers crumbling a little more each day, the thing beneath growing stronger. I looked up property records recently and discovered that the house has had 23 different tenants since 2017, none staying longer than 6 months, which means that whatever cycle of weakening and renewal the protective symbols were meant to maintain has long since broken down. Some mornings I wake up and check the local news from that area, half expecting to see a story about the house collapsing or someone getting hurt. But there is never anything, just silence, which somehow feels worse than confirmation. Taking a deputy's job in rural Pennsylvania seemed like the fresh start I needed after 15 years working patrol in Philadelphia, where the violence had ground me down to the point where I woke up expecting the worst from every call, every traffic stop, every domestic dispute that crackled over the radio. I was 39 when I applied to the sheriff's department, in a county so small I will not name it here, population under 20,000, spread across mountain valleys, where the main industries were logging, scattered farms, and the kind of poverty that had settled in after the coal mines closed decades ago. The sheriff, a man named Dennison, who looked like he had been cast in the role from Central Casting with his gray mustache and permanent squint, hired me during a 15-minute interview that mostly consisted of him asking if I could handle the isolation and the pace, which he described as 99% boredom and 1% chaos. My predecessor, a deputy named Marcus Webb, had left under circumstances that Dennison described only as personal reasons. When I asked for more details during my first week, wanting to know what kind of cases I might be inheriting or whether there were ongoing investigations I should be briefed on, Dennison got vague in a way that felt deliberate. He said Marcus had been a good deputy but had gotten himself wound up over some property crimes that were not worth the energy, that rural policing required knowing when to push and when to let things work themselves out through community channels. I filed that away as small-town politics, the kind of thing where everyone is related to everyone, and official channels sometimes take a backseat to unofficial understandings, and figured I would learn the rhythm eventually. The county was beautiful in that harsh Pennsylvania way. Steep hills covered in hardwood forests, narrow valleys with creeks that ran brown from iron deposits, houses scattered along rural routes that twisted through the landscape like veins. The sheriff's department operated out of a building that shared space with the county courthouse, and our entire force consisted of Dennison, myself, 2 other deputies who worked opposite shifts, and a part-time dispatcher named Carol who had been answering the phone since 1987 and knew every family in the county by name, voice, and history. My first month was quiet, mostly traffic enforcement and welfare checks on elderly residents who had not been seen in a few days, the kind of policing where you spend more time talking to people than arresting them. It was Carol who first mentioned the break-ins, almost casually, while I was filling out paperwork on a false alarm call. She said there had been a pattern over the past year, maybe 10 or 12 incidents, all targeting elderly people who lived alone in remote houses. Always the same method. Doors forced open during the day while the residents were away or asleep, cash and small. Valuables taken. Medicine cabinets rifled through for prescription painkillers. She mentioned that Marcus had been working on it before he left. Had even developed a list of suspects, but then he had just stopped coming to work one day in August, and nobody had heard from him since. When I asked if anyone had filed a missing person report, Carol looked uncomfortable and said Marcus's wife had moved back to Ohio and claimed he had gone with her, even though his truck was still parked at his rental house and his personal belongings were still inside. I started pulling files that evening, going through every report from the past 18 months related to burglaries or thefts targeting elderly victims. The pattern was unmistakable once you laid it out. The victims were almost exclusively in their 70s and 80s, lived alone in houses at least a mile from their nearest neighbor, and had limited family support. The stolen items were always cash, jewelry, and prescription medications, but the amounts were relatively small, never more than a few $100s, as if the perpetrators were being careful not to trigger major investigations. What struck me most was the lack of follow-up. Each report had been taken, statements recorded, but there was almost no investigative work beyond the initial documentation. No fingerprint analysis, no canvassing of neighbors, no attempts to track pawnshop sales of the stolen jewelry. Marcus's notes were scattered through the files in handwriting that became progressively more agitated. Early on, he had documented standard investigative steps, but by June, his notes included phrases like, "no cooperation from family members," "victims afraid to push charges," and "consistent interference." One note, dated July 23rd, simply said, "3 names keep appearing, all connected. Check property records and employment histories." But there were no names listed, no indication of who he suspected or what connections he had found. His last entry, dated August 4th, read, "Meeting with county clerk tomorrow. Records will prove it. Need to go to state police if local won't act." I drove out to Marcus's rental house on a Tuesday afternoon, a small ranch-style place on the outskirts of the county seat where the landlord said the rent was 3 months overdue and he was planning to evict and clear out the belongings. Inside, the house looked like Marcus had left, intending to come back within a few hours. Coffee cup in the sink, bed unmade, laptop still on the kitchen table, though the battery was long dead. I found his case files in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, dozens of pages of handwritten notes, photocopied property records, and photographs of houses that I recognized as belonging to some of the elderly victims. What I found buried in the back of the bottom drawer made my blood run cold. An organizational chart showing relationships between 3 county employees, 2 local businessmen, and nursing home. Administrator with lines drawn connecting them to specific burglary victims and dates. The chart suggested a conspiracy where someone with access to county records was identifying vulnerable elderly residents. Someone was monitoring their routines and coordinating the break-ins, and someone else was fencing the stolen property and potentially using the stolen prescription medications for resale. The 3 names at the center of Marcus's chart were people I recognized: a clerk in the county assessor's office, a volunteer EMT who responded to medical calls, and the owner of a local pawn shop. Marcus had documented that all 3 were related by marriage, that the assessor's clerk had access to property tax records showing who lived alone, that the EMT had responded to calls at nearly every victim's house in the months before they were burglarized, and that the pawn shop had sold jewelry matching descriptions from theft reports without requiring proper identification from sellers. I made copies of everything and locked the originals in my personal vehicle. That night, I started making inquiries, calling some of the elderly victims to follow up on their cases, asking if they remembered who had been in their homes in the weeks before the burglaries. whether they had noticed anyone unusual in their neighborhoods. What I heard was disturbing. Multiple victims mentioned the same EMT, a man named Dale Hutchins, had been to their homes for medical calls that seemed unnecessary in retrospect. Calls for minor complaints that could have been handled by their regular doctors. Others mentioned that the county assessor's office had sent someone to verify their property information shortly before they were burglarized, visits that had never resulted in any official paperwork. When I pushed them on why they had not mentioned these details in their original police reports, the responses were consistent. They had been told it was not relevant, that the sheriff's department was doing everything possible, that pursuing it further would be a waste of everyone's time. I took my findings to Sheriff Dennison on a Friday morning, laid out the copied files, and explained the connections Marcus had documented. Dennison listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and asked me how long I had been working in the county. When I said 6 weeks, he nodded slowly and told me I did not understand how things worked here, that Marcus had made the same mistake, seeing conspiracies where there were just coincidences and small-town familiarity. He said Dale Hutchins was a respected member of the community who volunteered his time to help people, that the assessor's clerk was doing her job verifying records, and that the pawnshop owner ran a legitimate business. When I pressed him about the pattern of thefts and the lack of proper investigations, Dennison's tone hardened. He told me I was hired to do a job, not to invent problems, and that if I could not adjust to the realities of rural policing, I should consider whether this was the right position for me. I left his office knowing I had 2 choices: drop it and learn to live with the corruption, or go over his head to the state police. That evening, I received the first threatening message. A note left on my windshield in the courthouse parking lot that read, "Marcus asked too many questions. Smart people learn from others' mistakes." The note was not signed, but the implication was clear. I filed a report with Dennison, who treated it as a nuisance complaint and suggested it was probably just teenagers playing a prank. 2 days later, my apartment was broken into while I was at work. Nothing taken but everything searched, drawers emptied, files scattered. A clear message that someone knew what I was looking at and wanted me to stop. I contacted the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in the neighboring county and requested a meeting with a criminal investigator. Detective Sarah Mitchell met me at a diner 30 miles from my jurisdiction, listened to everything I had, reviewed the copies of Marcus's files, and confirmed what I already suspected. This was an organized criminal enterprise that had likely been operating for years, protected by local officials who either were complicit or too intimidated to act. She said the state police would open an investigation, but it would take time, that they needed to build a case solid enough to overcome the political connections these people clearly had. She also said I should consider my safety, that whistleblowers in small communities often became targets, and that if I felt threatened, I should document everything and consider requesting a transfer. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, I received multiple threatening phone calls, had my tires slashed twice, and was subjected to a coordinated campaign of harassment designed to make me quit or discredit me. Dennison placed me on administrative leave for alleged policy violations that turned out to be fabricated, and several county commissioners publicly questioned my competence and suggested I was manufacturing a scandal to cover for my own poor performance. But the state police worked methodically, interviewing victims, analyzing financial records, and building a case that eventually resulted in arrests of Dale Hutchins, the assessor's clerk, Margaret Brennan, and the pawnshop owner, Leon Vickers. They were charged with conspiracy to commit theft, elder abuse, and trafficking in stolen property. The investigation also revealed that Dennison had been receiving campaign contributions from family members of the accused and had actively discouraged deputies from pursuing theft investigations that might implicate his political supporters. Marcus Webb's body was never found. The state police investigation concluded that he had likely been killed after threatening to expose the conspiracy. Though without physical evidence, no murder charges were filed. His truck was discovered 3 months later in a ravine 2 counties away, burned to a shell, and forensic analysis found trace evidence suggesting a second person had been in the vehicle, but could not identify who. His wife, when finally located in Ohio, said she had not heard from Marcus since July, and had only claimed he was with her because she had been threatened by someone who called claiming to be a friend of his, warning her that asking questions would put her children at risk. I transferred to a different county 6 months after the arrests, could not stay in a place where I had been marked as a traitor for doing the job I was hired to do. Dennison resigned under pressure, but was never charged with any crimes, and the 3 convicted conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years, far less than they deserved given the scope of their crimes and the likelihood they had been involved in Marcus's disappearance. I still check the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections website sometimes, tracking their release dates, knowing that in communities like the one I left, people have long memories and settle scores when they think nobody's watching. The elderly victims mostly received restitution from seized assets, but the damage went beyond money. They had been violated in their own homes by people they trusted, in a community that had failed to protect them, and no amount of compensation could restore the sense of safety they lost. The thing about driving the same route every single day is that your brain stops consciously processing the landmarks after a while. The commute becomes muscle memory, a meditative state where you can think about anything except where you are actually going because your hands and feet know the turns and stops without requiring conscious input. I had been driving Route 29 from my apartment in Wellsboro to the medical billing office in Mansfield for 3 years, 40 minutes each way, 5 days a week, and I could have made the trip blindfolded. Every curve, every pothole, every faded billboard advertising a farm stand that had closed in 2018, all of it was so deeply embedded in my routine that I barely registered the landscape anymore, which is why it took me almost 2 weeks to realize that the stone archway at mile marker 14 was not always there. I was 33, single, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment above an insurance office in downtown Wellsboro, where the rent was cheap because the building had no central air conditioning, and the stairs creaked loud enough to wake the dead. My job was exactly as boring as it sounds, processing medical claims and arguing with insurance companies about coverage denials, the kind of work that pays the bills but slowly drains your soul through 1,000 tiny frustrations. The drive home was the best part of my day. That transition period between the fluorescent office and my quiet apartment where I could listen to podcasts or music, or sometimes just the sound of my tires on pavement, and let my mind wander. Blackwood Road was the unofficial name locals used for the stretch of Route 29 between Mansfield and Wellsboro, a winding 2-lane highway that cut through state forest land where deer were a constant hazard and cell phone coverage was a fantasy. Mile marker 14 was roughly the halfway point, a straight section of road between 2 curves where the forest opened up slightly on the right side and you could see maybe 100 yards into the trees. I had driven past that spot thousands of times, and I would have sworn under oath that there was nothing there except trees and the occasional abandoned hunting stand. The first time I consciously noticed the archway was on a Tuesday evening in late September. I was running late because a system crash had delayed the end of my shift by an hour, and the sun was already setting as I drove home. The light was that peculiar golden orange that only happens in autumn, and as I came around the curve before mile marker 14, something caught my eye. A stone archway, maybe 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide, standing alone in the clearing on the right side of the road. It looked old, built from rough-cut limestone blocks that had weathered to a mottled gray, with what appeared to be carved symbols or letters across the top lintel that I could not read at highway speed. I slowed down instinctively, trying to get a better look, but by the time I had, decelerated enough to really see it. I was already past, and the curve ahead demanded my attention. I thought about it all evening, tried to remember if I had ever seen that archway before and simply not registered it. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that it was new, or at least new to my awareness. The next morning, driving to work, I paid special attention to mile marker 14, and the archway was not there. Just trees, the same forest I had been looking at for 3 years. No clearing, no stone structure, nothing. I told myself I had been tired, that the evening light had played tricks with shadows and made me see something that was not there. But I could not quite convince myself because the memory was so vivid, so concrete. Over the next few weeks, I started keeping track. Some evenings, the archway was there, solid and undeniable, standing in a clearing that should not exist. Other evenings, nothing, just unbroken forest. There was no pattern I could discern, no correlation with weather or day of the week or time of sunset. It appeared randomly, maybe 3 times a week, always in exactly the same location, always looking identical. I started taking my phone out while driving. Dangerous and illegal but necessary. Trying to photograph it when it appeared. But every time I managed to get my phone camera aimed at the right spot, either I had already passed it or the image came out too blurry to show any detail. I mentioned it to my co-worker Jennifer during lunch one day in October, framing it as a curiosity rather than something that genuinely troubled me. She looked at me strangely and asked what road I was talking about. When I said, Route 29 near mile marker 14, she shook her head and said she drove that route twice a week visiting her parents in Wellsboro, and there was no stone archway anywhere along it, that I must be thinking of a different road. I insisted, described it in detail, and she suggested maybe it was one of those historical markers the state sometimes installed, except she had never seen it. The conversation ended awkwardly, with both of us clearly thinking the other was wrong, but too polite to push it further. I started asking other people, casual inquiries framed as historical interest. The librarian at the Wellsboro Library had never heard of any stone archways along Route 29. The Historical Society had no records of architectural structures in that section of state forest. A guy at the gas station who had grown up in the area and claimed to know every back road and hiking trail looked at me like I was crazy and said there was nothing out there except trees and maybe some old logging roads that had been reclaimed by nature decades ago. The more people told me it did not exist, the more obsessed I became with proving that it did. On a Friday evening in late October, when the archway appeared again, I did something reckless. Instead of driving past, I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, put on my hazard lights, and got out of my car with my phone and a flashlight. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the forest was that particular kind of silent that happens in late autumn when most of the birds have migrated and the insects have died off. The archway stood maybe 50 feet from the edge of the road, and as I walked toward it through dead leaves and undergrowth, I felt the temperature drop noticeably, maybe 15 or 20 degrees, in the span of a few steps. By the time I reached the archway itself, I was shivering despite my jacket, and my breath was coming out in thick clouds. The structure was definitely real, solid stone that my hand touched and confirmed, cold enough to hurt my fingers even through my gloves. The symbols carved across the top lintel were worn almost smooth by weather, but I could make out what looked like dates or numbers, and possibly words in a language I did not recognize. The archway framed nothing, just more forest on the other side, but standing directly in front of it, I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Like every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to back away, to return to my car, to leave immediately. I took several photos with my phone, the flash creating stark shadows, and then I made the mistake of checking the temperature display. According to my phone's weather app, it was 52 degrees, but standing under the archway, it felt closer to freezing. I drove home faster than I should have, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and spent the entire evening reviewing the photos I had taken. They showed the archway clearly, undeniably real, stone and shadow and carved symbols. I uploaded them to my computer, zoomed in on the lintel inscription, and spent hours trying to decipher it using online translation tools and historical databases. The closest match I found was Old English or possibly Latin, and the partial translation I managed suggested something about a threshold or gateway, with a date that might have been 1952 or 1952, the numbers too worn to read with certainty. The next morning, Saturday, I drove back to mile marker 14 in daylight. No archway. I parked and walked into the forest where I had stood the night before, and there was no clearing, no disturbed ground, no indication that any structure had ever existed there. But when I checked my phone photos, they were still there, clear images of the stone archway that, according to physical reality, did not exist. I called Jennifer, asked her to meet me, showed her the photos. She stared at them for a long time, then asked very carefully if I had downloaded some kind of historical photo and was playing a prank. When I insisted I had taken them myself the night before, she suggested maybe I should talk to someone, a professional, because what I was describing was not possible. I started researching the history of that section of Route 29, digging through county records and old newspaper archives. What I found was fragmentary but disturbing. In 1952, there had been a state psychiatric facility called Blackwood Sanitarium located somewhere in the state forest near what was now mile marker 14. The facility had housed maybe 80 patients, mostly long-term psychiatric cases transferred from overcrowded urban hospitals. On October 31, 1952, a fire had broken out in the main building, and according to newspaper reports, all 83 patients and 7 staff members had died, trapped inside because the doors had been locked from the outside, as was standard practice to prevent escapes. The facility had burned to the ground, and the state had demolished the remaining structures and planted trees over the site rather than rebuild, citing the remote location and the tragedy making it impossible to staff. The sanitarium had been accessed through a stone entrance gate that was described in one article as an impressive limestone archway with the facility name and founding date inscribed across the lintel. The archway had survived the fire but had been demolished along with the other structures in 1953. Except according to my photos and my direct experience, it was still there, appearing and disappearing according to some logic I could not understand. The next time the archway appeared, I stopped again, but this time I did not get out of my car. I just sat there on the shoulder, with my engine running, watching it through my windshield. After maybe 10 minutes, I saw movement. A figure walking through the archway from the forest side, moving slowly, wearing what looked like a white gown or robe. Then another figure, and another until there were dozens of them, all walking through the archway in single file, all dressed in white, all moving with that same slow, deliberate pace. I turned on my car's high beams, flooding the area with light, and the figures stopped moving. They all turned to look at my car simultaneously, and even from 50 feet away I could see their faces were wrong, burned or melted, or simply absent, just blank spaces where features should have been. I reversed onto the highway without checking for traffic, nearly causing an accident with a truck that swerved and honked, and I drove home, going 20 over the speed limit, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. When I checked my dashboard camera footage later, it showed only static for the entire time I had been stopped at mile marker 14. Just gray noise and occasional flashes of light that might have been anything. I stopped driving Route 29 after that. I found a different route to work that added 15 minutes to my commute but avoided Blackwood Road entirely. I never saw the archway again, never drove past mile marker 14, never spoke about it to anyone except Jennifer, who politely changed the subject whenever I brought it up. But I still have the photos on my computer. Still have the dashboard camera footage showing 4 minutes of static that should show a woman sitting in her car watching ghosts walk through an archway that was demolished 70 years ago. 6 months later, I moved to a different town, took a job that did not require driving rural highways, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those figures in white, about how they all turned to look at me simultaneously, and I wonder if they are still walking through that archway, still trapped in whatever loop or memory or curse keeps them tethered to the place they died. And I wonder what would have happened if I had driven through the archway instead of past it, whether I would have emerged on the other side or simply vanished like they did, another missing person that nobody would think to look for in a place that officially does not exist.